addressed by Professor Bhagat Oinam, who will be delving into the indigenous worldviews of ethico-aesthetic contents. The session will be moderated by Nitesh S. Anchan. Nitesh is currently a research associate at the Department of Intercultural Studies at the Manipal Center for European Studies, MAHE. He is also finishing his PhD on animal minds from the National Institute of Advanced Science Studies, Bangalore. His PhD thesis argues for the presence of phenomenal conscience in non-human animals by critiquing the concept of non-phenomenal mind in philosophy and cognitive science. His academic interests include animal ethics, philosophy of mind, moral philosophy, and Indian philosophy. Nitesh, over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Meghni. I would like to introduce Professor Bhagat Oinam. Professor Bhagat Oinam is a professor and chairperson of Center for Philosophy at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He specializes in philosophical anthropology, existential philosophy, socio-cultural philosophy, ethics, and aesthetics. In addition, he writes on indigenous knowledge, conflict, and identity politics in Northeast India. He is also adjunct faculty at the Special Center for the Study of Northeast India, JNU. Some of his recent works include Alternative Worldviews, Sharing Life, The Ecopolitics of Reciprocity, and Revisiting Animism, an insider story of the Western discourse. For today's session, Professor will be speaking on indigenous worldviews and the ethico-aesthetic contents. So before we begin, I just want to inform our participants that if you have any questions, you can put those questions in the chat box or raise your hand. And in the end of the session, we'll give you opportunity to ask your questions. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nitesh, and also Dr. Richa. I'm very happy and delighted to be part of this program, Winter School, and thanks to my very close colleague and senior professor, Professor Siva Prakash, who thought that I could fit in this August gathering and also churning out of ideas. Unfortunately, I have not been able to meet him in person, but I'm sure I have listened to him and I have many more things to discuss with him. And I also had the chance to listen to Professor Nirmal, if I correctly remember, in the first session, and also partly with Professor Srinivas Murthy. And some of the things that I'm going to speak will link with what we heard today in the morning on Tenai, theorizing on Tenai thought, and even I would say the philosophical thought. In fact, I did not have this in mind, but after listening to Professor Nirmal today, I thought I can connect. And one of the purposes is when we talk of indigenous philosophies or traditional philosophies or philosophical thought, poetics, literature, one approach that we as scholars of social science and the humanities is to connect with different worldviews and perhaps, if possible, to articulate certain theoretical framework. What we have always been doing until now is to borrow theoretical frameworks from elsewhere. And when I say elsewhere, you know, the horizon from the world, that is what you call North. So from the European American theoretical framing, they have already got a big shops opened up in terms of methodology being deployed. And we are very quick in buying those methodologies which are already put before us. So it makes us easy to theorize without really trying our own way of theorizing. And this is one guarded caution that I'm making right in the beginning itself. Let me begin with what we understand by the word animism and animist thought. If you remember, famous philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein once said, when you are looking for meaning, do not look for definition, but look for the use. And this has helped us a lot in theorizing in social sciences, even in literary theorizing and criticism. That meaning of a word through which we try to understand part of the world need not be universally defined. We must not presume all the time that there is a definition and that we have to follow that definition for all time to come. And in fact, it should be in the way we use the word over a period of time, keeping in mind that those of us who are from philosophy, we often try to look at concepts through atemporality, beyond going the framework of the time. We think that concepts live atemporally. And I am someone who would like to critique that. And I think every concept, either social scientists engage with, or the philosophers engage with, or what you call humanities scholars engage with, is within the frame of time and space that must be taken into account, even when we theorize. And many of us in philosophy refuse to do this. So I belong to marginal groups in philosophy, which takes historicity very seriously. Now, look at the concept. Why I made this statement is to make sense of the term animism. You know, it was, if you remember, many of you who are from anthropology or from sociology will know that there was a concept called human Jew, and very popular in Europe in the early 20th century, beginning of the late 19th century, and it continued till the early 20th century. And one of the examples I can mention, and I have written this elsewhere, is famous anthropologist Madison Grant. He started a Jew called Bronx Jew in 1906, where he displayed a Congolese inhabitant, a native, a black Congolese. And what was put as a caption in the Jew is the missing link. I hope I'm audible to all of you. So this Jew, where you put an African Congolese inhabitants, brought it to Europe and to this Bronx Jew, and caption upon which all the white men comes to watch is the missing link between the apes and the man. And of course, you know, by man, it is literally the white man. We were excluded, certainly. This was a time in which James Fraser, P.B. Taylor, many anthropologists had this evangelizing attitude of what you call civilizing the savages. And the civilization, the light of civilization was in the European continent, and the savages are inhabited all across the globe, whether it is far North America, Latin America, Africa, even India, China, and many parts of Asia. And you might remember that many, when study of the white men in India came up, so Indians were seen as pagan culture. That is, these are the communities who worships idols, the inanimate objects, stones, trees, even at the most animate but non-moving entities like trees, lakes, mountains, they think have spirits, and these people worship. So anyone who worships spirits in all that around us in the nature were animist, and their thinking was primitive, not very civilized, not rationally articulated. So pursuit of philosophizing, subsequently the theorizing, were all through the idea of rationality. So reason as a foundational, or what you call a strong methodological tools to arrive at what we call knowledge. And those who depend on poetry, those who depend on ballet, those who depends on science and symbols and myths, you can see that whole articulation of how you look at not only people, civilization and differentiated, a hierarchy being drawn, and then you call these people by different categories. And this animism was a word that started representing those people who thinks that there are spirits in the entities around us. And they were looked down upon, and because a hierarchy was certainly drawn, a modernist, scientific, rationalist articulation that comes from the West. And those of us who study social science also follow the same yardstick. But interestingly, what has happened in the recent time, towards the end of the 20th century, over these 100 years, many feminist and environmentalist theorists have articulated or starting to relook at the very idea of animism. And very interestingly, when these people, and I have in mind in my reading scholars like Graham Harvey, Bart Davis, Andreas Weber, and many more. These anthropologists, these feminists, these what you call environmentalist, who comes even from biology, starts re-looking at the very idea of animism. And they start seeing the strength in this belief, in this worldview itself. Now, what Wittgenstein, from whom I borrowed initially, not to go for definition, but to go for use, is precisely coming out now, that when theorizing is being done on animism, at this point in time, the meaning has drastically shifted from a hierarchized positioning of this concept in the whole discourse of epistemology towards a horizontally driven parallel positioning. And one point that Graham Harvey comes up with is that, by the way, I was told by Professor Siva Prakash to speak on the indigenous communities of Northeast. I have not lost sight of that. Being a student of philosophy, I want to locate specificity of communities within a larger theoretical framing. That is why I'm engaging with you a little more time on the whole idea of indigeneity and what you call animism. And this time, the focus on animism is what Graham Harvey says, that these animists looks that there are, the nature is full of persons. It doesn't say anymore spirits, but full of persons. You know, persons, the whole idea of personal identity and personhood in philosophy and psychology is that person is someone who is autonomous, who is free, and who can also exercise its responsibility. Person is someone who has its own intrinsic value. If you remember how ethical discourses in the 19th century and 20th century emerged, was based on a clear-cut distinction of valuing, one which you call intrinsically valuable and another extrinsically valuable. So who are those? What are those who are intrinsically valuable? The human beings are intrinsically valuable. It is autonomous, it is free, it is responsible, and it is end in itself. It has its own value by its own choice, by its own identity, by its own life. Whereas those who are extrinsically valuable, that is the trees, The animals, the birds, the water, the environment, these are extrinsically valuable because they have certain qualities on those which human beings can use as resources. So those who are resources which can be used for the benefit of the humans are considered as extrinsically valuable, and human beings, on the contrary, are intrinsically valuable. So human beings are persons. We do not give this personhood to a child, mind you. We did not even give personhood to women at one point in time. We did not give women's voting rights. Fortunately for India, it became independent much late, and thanks to Ambedkar, man, woman, all were given adult franchise. But if you look at the history of political representation in Europe, you know that women's voting rights was very hard-earned struggle that first wave of feminism brought into. Before that, women were not given political rights to vote. That is known about Europe. Forget about rest of the world. So the personhood that implies that one is intrinsically good, responsible, and free. This was only given to the human subject. Now, when Graham Harvey is arguing that animist believes that everything in the nature, the animists believe that they are persons. The tree is a person, a mountain is a person, Gangotri for a Hindu is a person, Ganga, the river, which is a lifeline, is a person. So is an animal next to you, so is you, so is a child. Now, vocabulary is the spirit that used to be used earlier is not used anymore in this discourse on animism. That idea of the spirit that is concealed in all objects in the world is now supplemented by, or that has been exchanged with, what you called as personhood. Okay, this is one. Another point I will make, after which I will move towards a different direction, is another very interesting statement given by Bert Davis. This lady, a feminist, gives a very interesting statement. It says, if modernist epistemology, and when I say modernist, all social sciences and analytic philosophy and all are being put into that. If modernist, this is a quote unquote from maybe slight change in the language, maybe I can read it out. I should have been here. It is there, I think. I will read it out. This is from Nurit Bert Davis. That if cutting trees into parts epitomizes the modernist epistemology, I repeat, if cutting trees into parts epitomizes the modernist epistemology, talking with trees, I argue, epitomizes animist epistemology. To talk with a tree, rather than cut it down, is to perceive what it does. One acts towards it, being aware concurrently of changes in oneself and the tree. It is expecting response and responding, growing into mutual responsiveness, and furthermore, possibly into mutual responsibility. What is interesting about this statement is, if you look at any modernist epistemology, the science is part of that. Modern science is part of that, is that we want to dissect. In analytic philosophy today, in the mainstream philosophy, they will dissect a concept into parts and further clarify, analyze, come to the more clarity about what you are going to investigate in that concept. So is a life scientist who dissects a plant, the stem, looks at different cells, tries to know more and more about the cell. How can you know more about an entity of its part? Is by dissecting. but an animist doesn't want for that epistemology. Their knowledge about the trees is about hugging the tree, perhaps sitting next to the tree for moments together. So there is a non-verbal conversation perhaps was taking place between the trees and the humans. And this has been even in the mainland rural areas, maybe in south, in the north, you will find most often, I have seen this in the north, that in the middle of a huge paddy field, acres and acres, in the middle, I have often seen trees, big banyan trees. And I don't think the farmers were stupid to have kept it. There was certain mutual needs and responsibility between the trees and the humans. So what I am now arguing is that when Bert Davis and many more of this, even Andreas, when they are arguing on bringing back animism as a concept, still it is within the Western political, philosophical paradigm, because so much of environmental degradation they have done that they look back to this, what you call the primitive, and then now says that no, these views perhaps are much more humane, much more holistic, and we need to look back to this animism as a concept. Now that for myself, I'm not very keen to use the word animism, but I bring this as a discourse that we can really revisit what you call indigenous. Now, who are going to be the indigenous? If you look at the United Nations, statements on indigenous, which you can Google and find it out. It talks of the First Nations. It talks of the natives, whether it is of the Canadian, the American Indians, whom you call Red Indian at one point, or the indigenous people of Africa or Latin America, Mayan civilizations, those peoples, or you go to Aboriginals in Australia and New Zealand, and they have a specific definition of whom they are going to call as indigenous. So one way is going with them and arguing. And to that extent, many of these communities called tribes in Central Asia, India, or even the Northeast India, or even in your own states in Karnataka, there are many communities whom you call as indigenous or tribal communities. Those are one way of looking at. I'm not jumping into this, but there is yet another way of looking into, and which I want to provoke you with this, is through the writings of K.C. Bhattacharya, who is one of the very profound Indian philosopher who was in Santiniketan. And his writings on indigenous was that indigenous are the people. He thinks that Indian thought, Indian philosophy is indigenous philosophy. By indigenous, he was looking at non-modern, non-Western philosophical worldviews, or it could be literary worldviews, it could be folk traditions. Any worldviews that is non-modern or non-Europeans are called as indigenous for him. So Indian philosophical tradition, to some extent, can also come into this. Now, when I listen to this today on Tenai, the concept of Tenai in Sangam literature, and I had been doing some reading for quite some time, engaging with some of the Tamil scholars in Delhi University. Today, I got a more exciting points that needs to be explored further as a student of philosophy. What now is important to see for the term indigenous? I have kept the term indigenous open-ended. One is a definition that goes with the United Nations, specific program and identification of people and calling them as indigenous. Another is more philosophically articulating that non-modern, non-Western philosophical thought should be called as indigenous. So to that extent, thoughts in Tamil Tenai should be considered as indigenous because it emerged out of the local embedded life world. That is the reason why I would even incorporate or expand the idea of indigenous. And within that, what is important, this is my way of theorizing. This is loudly thinking. I'm working on that now. And I try not to get influenced by theorizing which are very well done in the West. Recently, I was speaking in one of the universities, in Tübingen University, in a similar theme. And when I talked of methodology of storytelling, because what you look at Tenai, the living and the non-living, which Professor Nirmal was talking today, is very interesting way of storytelling about how external landscape creates emotive feeling within the human sensibility. How the body of the self is extended to the body of the nature, to the landscape. So in inextricable relationship between this embodied self with an embedded world in which the nature is there. And this is what you can see in Tenai, and I'm coming to the Northeast very, very soon now. But the point that I wanted to make about methodology is, when I said about storytelling, people were very uncomfortable in the European audience, particularly German audience. What is storytelling all about? For us philosophers, you should come up with a very strong technical terms, right? So I told them perhaps it comes closer to hermeneutics, and then they get excited because I have used a term which is their vocabulary. So I told them, see, you have opened up a mall with lots of fancy shops, with lots of methodological tools. That is why I said content. And as long as me from a marginal community buys or pick up your things and use it, you feel happy because I am using your tools. And naturally, when the tools is yours, the findings will also be in your own line of thinking, right? Unlike the natural science, social science is such that we are not only tool makers, but we are also the content at the same time that we study. We create a tool and study ourselves. So the tool is already borrowed from them. So how do you expect that content explanation will be drastically different? So I refuse to buy by the animist definition, even if it is redefined by them, by Graham Harvey, and very fine articulation, yet I will not. And here I come. Now I have half an hour more to go, and I think I can do it. I hope I made sense to you so far. K.C. Bhattacharya talked, because of his 20th century being colonized by British imperialism, Swaraj in Ideas, the book he wrote. The idea of Swaraj, the freedom, Swaraj, that itself the Sandhi tells you, that the idea of freedom, not only about physically doing, but even the thought itself, is what the Indians really need. So he thinks that indigenous people, indigenous worldview of the Indians must be recovered first through this very, very strength of content of the Swaraj. Your methods, your approach, your own being must be through the recovery of the freedom. Without being free, you cannot. This is a very profound statement he was making. Freedom of thinking, freedom of imagination, freedom of articulation. And it is here that I want to go. And he has his own point because he was living at a time when it was under the British rule. And certainly certain concepts, certain ideas was predominant for him. To me, when I understand these indigenous people, and you can think, some of you might be a Tenai philosopher, a scholar. I'm not. I'm only a student learning to know more. Is that this two concept, this is of course coming from the West, the concept, but I'm explaining in a very different way, is that me as embodied, I as embodied self, is extremely important in the indigenous worldview, the embodiment of the self. And this I am borrowing from, and I don't have to hide that, from the phenomenological tradition, the embodiment, as you can see in Heidegger, in Sartre, and many others. But where I depart from them, after almost 10, 15 years of studying them, is that their inseparability of the consciousness from the bodily, the spirit from the body, is something uncalled for. To this, I will quickly, maybe for a minute or two, tell you how this idea of consciousness in the Western philosophical tradition emerged. If you go to the medieval philosophy, what was very importantly spoken was the idea of spirit, not consciousness. Spirit and the body was what was always a talk, a theological narrative, guided by the theological narrative. But the emergence of the science, emergence of the mathematical, astronomical, and many more forms of science in alchemy and so on, the spirit is no more talked about. And it got changed with something called mind. And you will find in René Descartes' dualism, who is considered as the father of modern Western philosophy, the duality is no more in the spirit and the body, but mind and the body. And mind is something, a substance, yet it is in the world. That everything I can doubt, but I cannot doubt that I'm thinking. And what is the thinking? Thought is reasoning, which is through the mind. It is the mind which thinks. So mind as a substance replaces the discourse which was enjoyed by spirit. And then the whole debate whether is mind only thought? If it is thinking, then it is a substance without the body, because body is separate, mind is separate. Mind has a characteristics called thought, and body has a characteristic called extension. So this dualism of Descartes, he himself was struggling to settle it, which he couldn't. The phenomenologist comes up with and take Husserl and take Sartre and many more, is that the mind again disappears from the discourse. What emerges is a concept called consciousness. And this time, this consciousness is not a separated entity like a ghost in Plato's idea of soul. This is what Jean-Paul Sartre says, that his idea of the consciousness is in terms of embodied consciousness, a consciousness which is bodily consciousness. There is no separation between body and consciousness. So you can either call it as consciousness, which is embodied as prefixing, or you use it as body, conscious body. Consciousness becomes prefix and body becomes suffix. You can interchangeably use this embodied consciousness or conscious body, but their articulation is critiquing Descartes and Plato and many more, is that embodied consciousness is inseparable. Indigenous thought goes against this. There is an idea of spirit that can go, and that is there in the 10I conception also, that for every landscape there is a deity that represents a spirit. And that spirit you may exemplify through a statue, but statue is not important, it is the spirit. But that spirit has a sense of embodiment in the nature, in some way or the other. So one way in which we can understand indigenous thought is through this idea of the embodied self. The second one which I would see is that this body is not to be treated in the very liberal sense of an autonomous self which are free to interact with other individuals who are free. It is always what today Professor Nirmal was talking of communitarian. I will not go into that discourse. He was still following the liberal discourses of liberalism and communitarianism. But I would say that the whole life of the embedded life of the people is that not only you are inseparably linked with other individuals which have kinship relationship, but you are equally inseparable with the environment, the space which is around you. The space around you is nothing but an extended sense of your own body. So the body around you, the space around you is almost like my body, extended body. That is why many indigenous community people, they would always like to die in the same place where they are born. So these two concepts I will come up with, that embodied self and embedded world, that this body is not separated from the world in which he or she is in. And to this, I will come with a method which I said storytelling. And this storytelling is a very significant method, I believe, to bring out some of the moral and the aesthetic life world, aesthetic sensibility, a moral sensibility that can come out not through your epistemic thought, jumbling articulations of reasons, but through sheer feelings. And if you remember, even Immanuel Kant, even after the critique of pure reason, practical reason in the judgment, at least he says that the truth that comes from feeling, aesthetic feeling of sublime, is the ultimate truth. That is why when Bertrand Russell said mathematics is beautiful, it means a lot. So I will not go into that, but look at this story where you will find a very interesting ontology, that being of, when I say ontology, the study of being, and this study of the being, I'm submitting that in indigenous worldviews, it is through embodied self. And this self is not isolated, but this embodied self, it is embedded in the world, in the environment where he lives. There is an inseparability, not only with the others. We say that in ethical discourse, that ethics is impossible. Moral philosophy is impossible without an other. If you look at Levinas, where the other becomes a significant point of ethical discourse. For the ethnic communities, the embedded world is inseparable from your own being. The ontology encompasses that givenness, the environment. And one thing I will tell you, this is a very interesting story, but also with a certain, my own way of reading to it. This origin myth of a community called Ao Nagas. Nagas are almost an ethno-nationalistic community now. Lots of communities who even do not speak the same language, all consider themselves as Naga. So it is a nationalist, a nation concept, a concept of nation. I say ethno-nationality. But within that, one community called Ao, who inhabits the Makokchung area of Nagaland. This creation myth tells that the Aos have come out of what they call the vocabulary. I wish I could recite. I was listening to Professor Nirmal today. The Tamil language is so sweet. I wish I could learn to be able to read some of the Sangam literature. They use the word lung terok, L-U-N-G, lung terok, T-E-R-O-K. Terok is 7, terok 6, and lung is stone, the 6 stones. And their origin myth says they have come emerged out of 6 big stones. Now, certainly it is animist. imagine what I said in the beginning, that if it was 18th, 19th century ethnographers or anthropologists coming, they will say, well, these communities are so primitive, they think that we can come out of stone. So naive are their thoughts. Now, interestingly, recent anthropologists, some of them well-trained from America, have written about it. I have got the articles with me. Now, this anthropologist, young anthropologist in 30s, they read this whole creation myth in terms of certain quote-unquote scientific categories used in anthropology, like migration, identity, myth-making, and nation concept. All right. So they articulate that basically this coming out of the stone is about marking of the place from where their original place of habitation was. It was nothing more than that, because their oral history, their faculty of imagination, because it was all oral tradition this community were following. So their myths, their folk tales, their ballets, it was centered around this place of origin where these 6 stones are there. It is somewhere in the China-Nagaland border, or Myanmar border. So this, they read, these anthropologists read that it is about a migration narrative with certain myths to tell you that this is an area from where you came up with, and they confine themselves. The stones become the marker, the final primeval marker, because beyond that, their folk memory does not capture anymore, because many has been lost. So you can understand this is how an anthropologist, quote, scientific anthropologists are reading this creation myths. But in literature, English professor who retired from Northeastern Hill University in Ceylon, and who is also a poet, story writer, Temsula Au. When I go through her writing, she gives some more narrative details that these 6 stones, 3 were males and 3 were females. So 3 stones which are males and 3 stones which are females. People have not written on that, but I have written a little bit, but not much. But can you see that how human imagination, whom the West at one point called as animist, primitive, could break the binary between the animate and the inanimate? Because animate and inanimate is a binary categorization based on our ordinary human perception and experience. We also have read Sri Aurobindo, the idea of consciousness, how it is ever pervading. So the belief that the life could come out non-life. I don't know, I'm not trying to be scientist, but even Durkheim also talks about that, isn't it? Life came out of non-life, if that is the case. But why do you think that water was non-life? And only the amoeba were the cells that was created where the life could multiply? There is a lot to think about this, but one doesn't need to go for justification of that belief. What is important for a student of philosophy is how human imaginations is so significant, so important to tell about the being of one's own existence. We all tell stories about ourselves. And this is also one way of telling story that me as an animate has emerged out of inanimate. So the binary between the exclusive binary between the animate and inanimate is broken down. And that's what I was listening to the lecture on Chennai also today about the human and the non-human. Whom are you going to incorporate? Now, another story, again, a creation myth. There is a group of community who speaks a conglomeration of a very wide language called Tani language. And there are many which comprises whom you call tribes. They are all under the scheduled tribe. I'm not very comfortable with the word tribes because every community has emerged out of tribe. We don't have to freeze anyone as tribe because people are all growing, right? In their myth of this Adi community, which I had been studying recently, is that the ultimate force of creation is a mother spirit. It comes closer, even you can compare this with the Prakriti Purusha, Shiva Shakti, whole idea of that, you know, one is constant. But here there is no male. Male comes later, perhaps. But the very significant point of creation is this mother spirit called Nenopadu. And he says that the belief is that all living beings, today there were talks about tiger and other animals, but here plants, everything else, all living beings has come out from the womb of Nenopadu. So in one sense, the whole universe of life has come from one primeval mother spirit, and that symbol of creation is through the human idea of the womb. Of course, it is somewhere it is I will be talking about this tomorrow, anthropocentric and anthropocosmic, but somewhere there is an anthropocentric aspect of imagination, use of language, but at the same time, the greatness of the environment, which is outside of you, or you are part of it. You are a small part of a larger environment, larger nature. That is somewhere recognized, that I am one, we are one among many living. And it is that mother spirit which have created, from whose womb all have emerged out. So killing of the animals unnecessarily, except for food or to survive, to protect oneself, while one will not go beyond that. I mean, that is the traditional wisdom. Of course, these wisdoms, we don't have to romanticize that everyone follows the wisdom. The Mahabharata is full of wisdom, but those who believe in Mahabharata does not follow it. Maybe they follow the violent side, but the philosophical aspect of Mahabharata, perhaps we don't bother. Dharam Sankat and the kind of sacrifice, I don't think the believers of Mahabharata don't go into that. So we are very clear about that. So this is also a wisdom thought about all living beings having a common origin and the kinship that is somewhere imagined. So it is an imagined kinship with the lived world. The world that is living are all part of the same mother from which we have all come up. And from the same community, I will tell further a very interesting articulation. And you will tell me where this narrative stands. I was in the residence of a healer, traditional healer. You know about the traditional healers. They use herbs, but there will not be quote unquote very strong scientific basis. But the lady who was a healer is an MSc degree holder and a biologist. What is this? Presently, there is a government institute which is trying to tie up with lots of this indigenous medicines. I'm forgetting this, Ayush, I think, Ayush. So there is an Ayush institute in Itanagar, not Itanagar, sorry, this is, where did I go? I'm forgetting this, Pasighat. This is adjoining Assam and Arunachal Pradesh. So in that, this healer is also working. So she knows both the world of the medical and also of the tradition. And there is lots of what you call, quote unquote, what an ordinary intelligent man would say is superstitious myth, because she also goes by dreams. So there is no specific medication pattern. So somewhere, sometimes she feels like this is the best way to do it. Sometimes that is the best. Maybe this medicine, constantly she is doing. But since she has a background of the biology, she is also aware of the medicinal values of these plants. But what is important for me right now is not that, but there was a ritual that was performed on the day I reached there. And the ritual is a sacrifice of animals, an offering to the spirit of the forest. Now, for you and I, many of us, irrespective of I am born in the Northeast, we might see this as extremely superstitious, and if you are little sober and cultured, you will not comment. At the most, you will keep quiet. And if you are little blunt, then you will say, what is this? Now, the belief is that this ritual is called ipak. And so the bamboos, there are certain rituals, technicalities, those rituals one need not go into. But this is an offering of rice beer with animals, inner part, intestine, and all those. The belief is, and that is where I'm coming, is that the forest is not owned by us. We don't own the forest. Of course, this is now changing very, very fast in the Northeast India. There is a fight between the communities who want to own the forest because they can cut it down and sell the trees, where in Delhi and Kolkata, people are making nice houses and the windows and doors with those trees, right? One government who wants to call it, which as what you call reserve forest. So there, the old capital has already infringed into that. So you cannot call these people as tribal in that Puritan sense anymore. The capital, the importance of market, this is already crept in the psyche. So the land in the present day is that you're fighting for community land and the state land, right? So state says this has to be reserved, it has to be protected, and the community says it is our land. And if the community is ruled by a chief, then he can sell off any number of trees, get it cut down. So that is the new politics that is emerging. But as a student of cultural philosophy, let me confine to that worldview. And that the worldview is that the forest, we do not own the forest. The forest is owned by a deity, a spirit. And that takes me very close to some of the narratives in Mahabharata. If you remember Yaksha Prasna, you remember that when these 5 brothers and the wife were going and they were all thirsty, and then suddenly they see a pond, and then without asking, they all jump and start drinking. And Yudhishthira says, don't do it. And then they all died. Then, like what you call argumentative Indians, the Yaksha comes up, asks questions, Yudhishthira gives answering. So Indians love question and answer, even in the peak of their death and life. And that is also how the civilization has moved on. But lighter side, but there is a merit also in this, the wisdom. So in this whole ownership story, the Adis believe that this deities, since the herbs that our people go and cut and bring does not belong to us, but we have to pray and offer and say that, well, we need your things. We need those to survive. So I'm offering. So it is a negotiation with the spirit that is, because it doesn't belong to you at the first place. If it belongs to you, then you can cut down at any point in time. So the belief that everything in the world does not belong to you and it belongs to the spirit is still somehow recognized till now. So that I found is very fascinating in one sense, this thought itself. I could not touch upon the aesthetic side, but because that will go another half an hour. I have very exciting things to share, maybe some other time I will do. But last one more narrative, which is very interesting, from a community called Angami Naga. And these communities, under the leadership of Fijo, resisted Nagaland, Naga area, to be part of India. They fought back very strongly against Nehru, Indian army and all that. The very strong, ferocious, freedom-loving people. And many ethnographers, and one I can mention is Hemmendorf, that is a German ethnographer who wrote a book, Naked Nagas. So they were all harp-clad, headhunters, they are barbaric. This is how the Christianity also came to this world, saying that you are headhunters, you kill people for trophy, you were half naked, all those. But when I went for a study on aesthetics and ethical world in these communities, they have a word called Kenya, Keuneu, I think, Kenya. And this you can, as a sociologist, say taboo. Is a simpler term, is a taboo, what is not to be done. But I say that more than the taboo, this is about a moral obligation, which you call dharma. In the Indian Sanskritic context, the dharma is nothing but it is about a self-generated obligation that you think something is right, you abide by that. And they say that when they go for hunting, and this is the Angami belief, and just see, when I said this, many Angami professors started working on this aspect, is that when they go for a hunting, and if you see your prey, unguarded, unaware that you are right behind it, and you can shoot and kill either by arrow, by spear. Guns comes much later, but imagine of that time when it is a spear or an arrow. It is Kenya if you do not sound the prey. That means if you do not give a signal to the prey which you are going to kill for food, it is Kenya, it is forbidden. It is improper if you do not give a sign, a signal to the one you are going to kill. Because the animals also has I'm using an English vocabulary called right, but this is my interpretation. They will say something else. They call it Kenya, but the animals also has a right to survive. And you have the right to kill because you have to survive as well. That is your food. You kill for food, but that food is animate, not inanimate. And it should be allowed to run, and then you chase. If you fail, then you lose. If you win, then if you kill, then you win. And that is the courageous, rightful conduct of Angami warrior. And if you kill a prey unguarded, without even giving a chance to the prey to flee, it is Kenya. It is extremely forbidden. What more sound ethical principles this could be? And you see that the Christian missionaries and ethnographers, the German, the French, the English who came, only saw the nakedness of the body and killing of the heads, but has not the French and the Englishmen hunted their own heads for 100 years? We have all read 100 years of war between, was it not head hunting? I keep saying that, why do you only think of the holding of the head? but you kill somebody and take a pride in that, put a medal in your chest. It is also that you are a headhunter. You have killed someone. So what I wanted to submit is the underlying principle of connectedness, of sharing of life. There is violence, no doubt, there is killing involved, but that is only for sustenance. But otherwise, the belief is it has a chance. And this is, I look at it like this, that it is built on an ontology where it is about embodied self, and this embodied self is embedded in the world it is born in. And that is what you called a localized worldview, a localized philosophy. Even what you call in Dennai is precisely that. The landscape that evokes sensibility within you, whether it is about pain of separation, it is about romance, it is about violence, but that is how it is. So I think I will put a full stop here. Is it not, Nitesh? I think I'm right on dot on time.
Yes, you are right on time, sir.
Because if I continue on aesthetics, I have a lot more on the Manipuri classical and non-folk traditions, but that will take another half an hour. Unless you don't want to ask questions, I can go to that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor. We now open ourselves for discussion. If you have any questions, do raise your hand, or you can ask the professor right away. But just to open with a few remarks that I had on the lecture, you have made very interesting observations regarding the ontological and epistemological issues pertaining to how do we understand these quote-unquote indigenous cultures, tribals. And we have been engaging in a project here where we are studying a specific culture called culture in the sense of Tulu culture. And the Tulu-speaking people who are concentrated only in the coastal part of Karnataka. It's a small population comparatively, it's a 20 lakh population people who speak Tulu, but it's a thriving language. It has a strong connection with nature worship, especially even the way you mentioned about it. It has so many resonance with such kind of attachment with nature. But at the same time, in the course of my study, for 5 months now, we have realized that even though the spirit is alive, in the sense of you pray, you have your bhutas, you have your understanding of what nature is in some sense, the deification of animals, etc. The product of it is not something which is what we wanted. Like it's been comfortably coexisting with neoliberal capitalistic policies where you have ravaged the land and you have kept this one specific space separate for this nature worship, which is not at all something I think which I would agree to in some sense, because of the spirit in which these deities have been prayed for, has some very strong connection with the land and nature. Now you remove the context, you have deified these ideas as well. You have deified these nature gods and kept them outside of nature, because there's so much profit here for people to sell their land, to lease their land out for other businesses. And another concern what I have with this specific idea is there seems to be, even when we study the epistemological, ontological structures embedded within these specific tribes and cultures and communities, there seems to be a lack of scholarship clearly explaining what is the nature of this relationship of ideas that we have. I mean, and this is for various reasons. First of all, we don't have specific philosophical tools pertaining to these kind of studies, right? All the, as you have already mentioned, the kind of tools that we take is mainly influenced by certain philosophical work of people from outside of this region, and sometimes they do not capture the local essences because, of course, they are not made for that reason. They capture the essences of their own places in some sense. Now, how do we go about in trying to coming up with a philosophical a system or a structure to clarify the conceptual and epistemological ideas that is embedded in these kind of tribes, or or culture, or really indigenous knowledge systems. Yes, sir.
Do you want me to respond, or I think I take it as a food for thought?
Okay, sir. Do we have any more questions?
Or maybe you can pin down the questions. Somehow I thought I was listening to you more than a question. Yeah.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? Do you have any questions you want to ask?
Nitesh, perhaps the questions are not there. Maybe can you reframe your question quickly again?
Yeah, in few words, I mean, if I want to, the last question was specifically regarding how do we come up with a framework where we are able to clarify the epistemological, the ontological, and philosophical ideas embedded in these cultures. Because now, given the fact that we don't have tools specifically catering this, right? How do we do that? And I mean, even in your talk, I feel that there's a lot of there's a scope for a lot of work. There's a scope for a lot of clarification. There's a scope for specific ways in which we need to clarify how these different connections are formed within the community, right? So that was specifically my question, sir.
See, I will quickly respond like this. If you look at, yeah, there are more questions, but let me respond to Nitesh. It was a very significant question you have raised. If you look at the way theories have emerged in the West, it is the question of their time. It is out of churning. Even look at Habermas and all his communicative rationality, communicative actions, how from coffee houses, the whole question of democratic space being utilized in a particular way, there has always been a context within which the whole, the rationality that has emerged has come up. And also earlier to that, the kind of reason that has been looked into. So what is important for us now, I believe, for me, is to go to the specific concepts, the idea embedded in those cultures. We might use the word, a blanket term called indigenous, but it doesn't say much unless you come up with specificity, a specific concept. Like, for instance, Indian philosophy, of course, you can say it geographically, Indian philosophy, a huge area, right? But what kind of Indian philosophy you are going to do? And once you come to that, you have to come to the specific areas. Then even if you use the word Purusha, for instance, then you will immediately be asked, next question, are you talking of Purusha in this Sankhya tradition? Or are you talking of Purusha in the other traditions as well, maybe in Nyaya tradition? And these are different. I hope I'm making sense to you. Yes. Or Jiva, the idea of Jiva and Ajiva, like Bhagavan, the idea of Bhagavan or God, if you look at the Nyaya concept, or if you look at what you call, I'm saying this because your department is engaging with philosophy department, how it is used in Jainism. Recently, I was listening to Professor Veer Sagar Jain, that for them, the idea of Bhagavan is someone who transcends the Jiva and Ajiva distinction.
Yeah.
That was a brilliant presentation. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I don't know if Professor Bhagat can hear what I'm saying, but it was very enlightening making these connections with Tinay. But the problem that we are talking about right now, how do we really talk about this, is I think there are two things involved. One is the idea, formulating an idea about what we are talking about, like how we do it. Professor Bhagat was talking about the problem has been looking at everything from a definitional point of view instead of a kind of a pragmatic point of view. So that's one of the issues, like how we frame a particular, concept, a theory or whatever in the first place. And the second thing is the translation of it, because we are not talking in the same language. Professor Bhagat is not talking, in his own language. He's using English, and that is that is what brings in certain other problems, because every language has its own cultural baggage. And he made a mention of this when he used the word right. He wanted to communicate something to you, and the nearest thing that he found was the English word right. Okay, so that is what I'm talking about. Now, the same problems I do have when I talk about Pinay in English, because my audience are not just Tamil people all the time. I'm talking to all people all over the world. So I'm compelled to use English. And when you use English, you are kind of resonating certain things which you didn't really mean to. I mean, he himself pointed out this particular word communitarian, which I was using. I really want to have a dialogue with him after this presentation, maybe through an email or something like that, about, what I mean by it, how probably it's not the same thing as what, he was referring to. So that's the thing, like, I need to use some English word in order to communicate this idea of the philosophical anthropology that I have. So, but it's not exactly, community as it is used by the Western scholars in their discourse. So that translation is another issue when we talk about one culture to another culture, people of another culture. So these are some of the things that we need to keep in mind, I guess. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor. So Professor Oinam will take questions now. We have Karmanye who wants to ask a question. Karmanye, can you?
Yes. Am I audible?
You are, yes.
Okay. So I basically, before asking the question,
Yes.
I had a very quick thought to share. When you mentioned, sir, that the animate has come out of the inanimate, and whether this idea can be scientific. Well, scientifically, we all come from the Big Bang. And if that Big Bang star was inanimate, then certainly everything has come from, all animate objects have also come from something inanimate, very scientifically speaking. That's just a passing comment. But other than that, I also wanted to mention that, when the previous question that was posed about ontological and epistemological and methodological challenges, frameworks that we can use to understand indigenous people, I was wondering, Edward Said's, discourse on post-colonialism, he tries to offer a certain framework, but I think that framework is also so bitter and resentful towards Western modes of thinking. It doesn't acknowledge that a Westerner can even try to be objective. So that, to my mind, is also very problematic. Plus, when we talk of indigenous peoples, we shouldn't ignore the Native Americans or the Aborigines of Australia or the Maoris in New Zealand who inhabit the West, so to speak. But they have been indigenous peoples in their own right, whose discourse is sometimes overrepresented or sometimes ignored. But I just wanted to have your thoughts on Edward Said's framework and looking at this problem of indigenous peoples. What do you think of his framework?
Thanks a lot. That was Karmanya, is that?
Yes, so that's right.
Yeah. Yes, when I make the passing remark, that was a very lighter vein when I went to Darwinism. I mean, certainly that was not what I meant, but yes, I was only joking that, there is nothing to be so presumptuous about for us against this quote-unquote animist. But to be able to imagine beyond the binary of the animate and inanimate is, I think, extremely profound thinking. Absolutely. And this has been done much more. I mean, in the case of the natives, or what you call this indigenous, they have not engaged with the kind of epistemology that is being done in classical Indian philosophy, for instance, right? But the poetry, or the ballet through which they sing. It also carries imagination, and human imagination is something that should be taken seriously and not to be all the time hierarchized. Because we in philosophy tend to think that unless there is, anvixiki, that the reasoning articulation involved, that is not knowledge. So is in the West, that belief is a belief, but unless it is what you called a true, what is that, justified. That's what we hold the JTV thesis, right? So this, even thinking that, well, a knowledge is always to be a justified true belief, it comes from a particular trend of doing philosophy. And Heidegger is one very clear example which goes beyond that and perhaps says that it is through poetry. And it is between the lines that you can capture the ontological fervor, the flavor of human existence, and not necessarily through logic chopping all the time. That is also one way of philosophizing. But if poetry is taken seriously, then I am submitting that even this so-called indigenous primitive, they have also a worldview that we need to think. And for that, I was suggesting to Nitesh that perhaps the concept that they are using needs to be as far as judiciously taken note of, because I am reminded of what you call McIntyre's when he writes that when the English translation of eudaimonia is translated as happiness, and what Professor Nirmal was saying, the problem of translation, it was certainly not in the way Christian happiness is, or the kind of happiness which the utilitarians are talking about. It has so much to do with excellence. It has so much to do with perfection. It has so much to do with virtue, right? So translation has always a limitation. So when we go to the indigenous thought, maybe we should do justice by going as close to them as possible. But limitations, we have to work within the limitations. That is what we should do. I think I made sense to you.
Professor, we have 3 questions right now. So we have Deepanjali who wants to ask a question, and we have 2 questions in the chat box. So I would like for Deepanjali to go ahead and ask a question, and I'll end with these 2 questions in the chat box. Okay? Yeah, Deepanjali.
Thank you, Professor Bhagat, for such a fascinating lecture. I have 2 questions. The first is just an information that I want about the book that you mentioned in the very beginning of your lecture, where you talk about the author talking of modernist epistemology. If it is about cutting down the tree, then animist is about the responsive communication. What is the name of the book?
See, that one at the moment I'm unable to trace it, but I will write down the name of the author. I mean, yeah. I can spell out. I don't know, is there a chat box here?
Yes, there is. Yeah.
Let me just type it out here.
Okay, and I have another.
Please tell me. I will type meanwhile.
Yeah. The other question that I have is about the idea of violence, which I find quite interesting, because whereas the Western understanding of violence in case of nature is, whereas it comes from a position of separateness of human and nature, and hence also the savior complex that humans have to save nature now. So that is one kind of violence that I see, vis-a-vis the other kind of violence that we are seeing, where we're talking about kin, where the animal is given the chance to flee first before killing it, right? The sense of justice and the sense of equal is coming out very strongly here. So I'm wondering if there is any alternative word for such kind of violence, because I'm a little uncomfortable mixing both kinds of violence. Do you have an?
Yeah. See, I wrote on this, but see, my book is going to come, but I'm delaying. I'm a very lazy person. So Indira Gandhi National Center for Arts has commissioned that I should bring it out. In fact, Springer agreed, but they refused Indira Gandhi to collaborate. So I got a little disappointed. Anyway, that's a personal side. But rather than justice, I would use the word fairness, to be fair. again, you know, Professor Nirmal is here. We cannot help the English language that we are using. We are trained into this so much, so it will creep in, definitely. But to fairness to all, the idea of justice perhaps is a far-fetched concept to be applied, but to be fair to everything around you. And that is what I saw very significant. And this fairness is also used by John Rawls in his whole theory of justice. Is all about fairness, to be fair to each other. But here it is certainly not about communities who come to terms with each other, but it's about a world, an embedded world to which you live and you have to survive and let others survive. You know, so I think fairness could be a better word to be used for this.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Deepanjali. So I'll just, if you can,
I don't know, did I answer you the first question? I missed out. Is it, or have I?
The question was just if there is an alternative word for this kind of violence that you talked about in the indigenous context or with you. I don't know.
But I think we don't have to be so much, be upset to use the word violence. Violence is a part of our life. But only thing is when violence is done with a certain ill intention, that is what we should avoid. I mean, if you ask me, my political position at one point was that violence for a better goal is justified. And my German friend who had his parentage from both the Nazi and the anti-Nazi camp would all the time tell me, this is paucity of thought, that you don't have alternative to violence. That is why you are justifying it. But your failure to think of an alternative and justifying violence is no answer. I think he was right. I'm wrong. I was wrong. I have changed my mind over this period. Violence is certainly something that we must try to avoid. But if it is unavoidable, so be it.
Professor, we'll go with two more questions.
Yeah.
I'll read the questions. I'll read both the questions, and you can respond to both of them. So the first question is by Kanchan Gogate, and the question is: how does outsider and insider study understand indigenous? Okay, how do they understand the idea of indigenous when you look at this from the framework of the outsider or the other group? And the second question is by Divya Iyer, and she asks, how does the claim of the liberal Western world on the universality of knowledge affect the knowledge and identity of other communities? You can respond to both of them.
Okay, so please remember the first one because I am starting with the second and I may forget. So I have entered into a philosophical, personality of forgetting things very fast. So was it the first question about universality of knowledge that you say?
This is the second
the liberal, this communitarian and also virtue ethicist, who communitarians also are part of the larger liberal politics, of course. I mean, the fight between the liberals and the communitarians are certainly family fight. In election, you often say is a friendly fight, right? So it is a, I think, friendly fight between the liberals and the communitarians. So to that extent, this book, long back written by Alasdair MacIntyre, whose justice, whose rationality, responds to the kind of universal idea of justice, universal idea of reason. Yes, we have Immanuel Kant and many in the West talking about the universal knowledge, universal reasoning. I think it is a suspect. We must not take this very seriously. And I do not think it is time for me now to respond to that very long way. This is already known. I mean, I just gave the example of MacIntyre, whose justice, whose rationality itself says that there is multifaceted nature of rationality. And I would rather suggest you, and I had been telling, I wish some social scientist writes on this, the whole Syadvad of Jainism. And it is, if there is a 2-valued logic, if there is a 3-valued logic, this is a 7-valued logic. The statements of reality can be explained through 7 possible statements, 7 possible propositions and conditional propositions, because our statement about reality is always conditional. It is always from a context that we make a statement. And what more profound thought than this Jainism Syadvad is? I'm just dreaming to see some social scientists write on it. This is all my response to you. What was the first question?
Yeah, the first question is, how does outsider debate, the idea of the outsider, understand the indigenous? So I'm an outsider to the community, and what is this debate, the anthropological and philosophical debate about the idea of the other? How does that understand the idea of indigenous?
Yeah. This is an unending debate. And philosophical debates are always unending. And that makes it so interesting that every time you enter, you begin right from the scratches with different arguments. This insider-outsider, let me give you one very interesting example from my Northeast India. The Nagas, who has been very critical, and now they are under political dialogue with government of India about being a part of India or not. So they say our history has been written by the colonizers, first by the British colonizers, second by the Indian colonizers. So they are all outsiders. They never understand our culture, our history. So only the Nagas will write Naga histories. So it is as good as saying only the Tamils will write about the Tenai, not Bhagat Oinam. So if I write about Tenai, they will say, what do you know about this? But I'm so fascinated with this that I'm going to write to Professor Nirmal now more, read his writings. So this whole idea of insider-outsider is a politics of exclusion and inclusion. You want to exclude, you want to delegitimize someone, you put it. But then, of course, there is a truth. There is a strength in this argument also, is that how the colonizers have written, like example I have given about animism, how they have looked into it. This is also misrepresentation is also a threat, and that has happened in human history. But this mistake of readings and others' culture from outside must not lead you to see that only the insider must read. Now, if I say that this is a famous Wittgensteinian philosophical mind debate, that if you have a toothache, how do I know that you have a pain? I don't feel your pain. So it is like Dalit epistemologists, Dalit theorizing to say that the non-Dalits, the upper caste, must not write about Dalits because they have never experienced that pain. So this exclusion politics, I think it is a very narrow politics, at least to my mind. Yes, there are mistakes in the past. There are even deliberate mistakes that are being made. That also I accept. But having said that, completely making an insider-outsider in terms of legitimizing one and delegitimizing the other is not a good politics. You know, this word empathy, which the phenomenologists use, but long back in the similar concept of karuna is being used in Buddhism. The sympathy, the empathy that you can have about the others. I am also a human, you are also a human. We belong to different cultures, but I also feel that pain, you also feel, it may not be the same pain, but the sharing of the pain. If you believe in humanity, there is a possibility of a humanity, then I think there is sharing possible. If you think that humanity is only a dream, there is no humanity possible, everything should be ethnocentric, everything should be caste-centric, everything should be gender-centric, then we are going narrowing and narrowing down, and the end product is only I and nobody else. So if you are segregating, last minimalist position is the first person, singular, subject, I, nothing more than that. So do you want to reduce itself to the I? But even within the Dalit, who gives you permission to write the authentic? What is the guarantee that if you and I are Dalits, your narrative will be an authentic narrative and mine will not be one? I hope I made sense to you.
You did, sir. Thank you so much. We have past 1.5 hours given to us, but in the end, I just want, before I thank you, Professor, I want Professor Shiv Prakash to share his thoughts about the session.
I'm very happy that the second day sessions have pushed the discussion much further than yesterday, because today I think the three presentations made, the first one by Professor Selvamani, and then the second by Professor Murthy, led by Professor Oinam, have not only talked about the two concepts, aesthetics and ethics, but they've also invited us, challenged us to relook at our categories of thinking about these, themes. This is one of the purposes why I thought it was important to have this kind of winter school, because we have been talking about aesthetics and ethics. We're not also talking about the trying to re-examine the very frameworks in which we are trying to look at them. I think the three presentations have successfully challenged us to re-examine our frameworks and our ideologies of understanding these things. And I thank all the three speakers because there's not been, it's not been easy to learn, follow their presentations, but it was worth the while. And thank you for all of you for taking the trouble, and then thank all the participants and the chairpersons of different sessions. Thank you. I hope to see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you.